Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Majer Masanov, and I welcome you on behalf of the Cluster Office of UNESCO in Almaty. We are starting our 15th webinar, which is on museum institutions, activities, and we can talk about some advanced trends or issues related to the museum business all over the world and Central Asia. Today, our webinar is about illicit trafficking of cultural properties and participation of the international museum community. Oh, no, apologies. This is my old topic, sorry. Again, apologies, I confused that was the previous one. Now our topic is illegal trafficking of cultural properties, legislation, conventions, and their implementation. And our speaker today is very much experienced in combating illicit trafficking and policymaking in this area. It's Mr. Etienne Clement. He's an international lawyer who has worked with UNESCO since 1984, different positions. So he will introduce himself in more detail, but I would like to mention that jointly with our colleagues at the UNESCO office in Bangkok, he published a publication on combating illicit trafficking in Southeast Asia. It's kind of methodologies. So Mr. Clement was recommended to us not just by our Bangkok colleagues, but by previous speakers that we had before. They say he's an interesting expert, a very serious one. Later in the chat box, you will have a link to the YouTube channel of the UNESCO Almaty office, and you can watch the recordings of previous workshops. Now, to track the news or updates on new webinars or any updates on our office, you can subscribe to us in social networks. Later on, you will have a link in the chat box. Before I pass the floor to our esteemed speaker, I would like to mention, so you have an opportunity to ask your questions in the chat box or comment after the presentation, which is going to take about an hour. So after that presentation, we can have a Q&A session. And as I mentioned before, you can listen to the presentation either in Russian or in English, and also watch it in your devices. So this is basically all logistic issues, and this is my pleasure to pass the floor to our speaker. Mr. Clement, please, the floor is yours.
Добрый день. Good afternoon. My name is Etienne Clement, and indeed, as Majer Masanov has introduced me briefly, I've been working with UNESCO for many years, but I've been trained as a lawyer and as an international lawyer. And having worked in UNESCO since 1984, I, in fact, developed my expertise in the field of international conventions for the protection of cultural heritage. And that includes the Convention on Illicit Traffic in Cultural Property, the one I'm going to speak to you about today. So I'm very pleased to share my thoughts and experience with you all. I had the opportunity to visit Central Asia several times in the past. Last time was 2 years ago in Uzbekistan. I've been in Kazakhstan and other countries, also in the South Caucasus, but a little bit longer ago. So I'll share my screen in English, and you can switch to the Russian interpretation, to the Russian version easily, as instructed by the technician. As indicated on the screen, I'm going to speak to you about cultural objects and the way that countries, but also professionals, and that includes museum professionals, can contribute to fighting illicit trafficking in cultural objects. But the first thing we can ask is, what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about cultural objects, and basically ancient cultural objects, like those exhibited on the screen. These cultural objects are not necessarily, do not necessarily have an aesthetic value. They can be artistic works of art or not. They can be museum items. They can be in private collections. They can be in commercial galleries. They can be in religious place. They can be in civilian place. All these categories of objects fall into the categories of cultural objects under UNESCO and international definition. These objects can be also unknown, means that they are in the under the ground or under the water, and because they are removed from under the ground or under the water, they are known and become cultural objects, which may be protected under the conventions. Sometimes, and it is unfortunately very sad, they are coming from dismantled monuments. All the objects that I have described, all these categories, are generally protected under national legislations protecting cultural heritage. Here are, again, a different kind of objects, some in wood, some under the water, which are protected under the acronym of cultural object under national legislations. What do national legislations protect when they speak about cultural objects? I have observed, and that is most likely the case in Central Asia and South Caucasus, the national legislation protecting cultural objects do protect ancient objects which are more than a number of years, more than 50 years, sometimes 75 years, or 100 years, and which are of significance for history, religion, rituals, science, or cultural expressions. In the terminology used by UNESCO and other international organizations, we also call cultural object movable cultural property, as opposed to immovable cultural property, which are monuments and sites, or sometimes cultural property. So the terminology is sometimes different according to various texts. In English, we used cultural objects, cultural property, movable cultural property, but basically we are speaking about the same things. Ancient objects, which are more than 50 years, 75 years, or 100 years, as defined by the national legislation. Some legislation define 50 years, some 100, some 75, and which falls into these categories. We are not speaking about objects made by contemporary artists. So all what I'm going to speak about today, when I speak about illicit trafficking in cultural objects, does not cover works of art which are made nowadays by artists. For them, the rules are completely different. The artists have indeed, under many legislations, the right to export their works of art. And actually that's which provide them with income. Nowadays, artists, whether they are painters, sculptors, or others, do sell their works of art abroad. So the rules of restrictions that I'm going to speak about are really related to those objects defined by national legislation as cultural object of more than a number of years, minimum 50 often. These ancient cultural objects, and this is unfortunately a trend all over the world, are affected by a number of offenses. Destruction, intentional, which means that obviously group of people want to destroy them, often for political reason. It's also vandalism. Ignorant people do attack cultural objects simply by the pleasure of destroying them. Theft, looting, pillaging, this is what we're going to talk about. Dismantling of monuments, which are taking off a piece, like on this slide, taking off the face of this carving, was clearly destroyed, either by intention to destroy what it represents, or more likely because the face, as removed, can be sold. So more seriously, and that affects very much the region of Asia and the Pacific, there is an offense against objects from under the ground, what we call illegal excavation, or from under the water. The problem when these objects are removed from under the ground or from under the water, like this object here on the slide, is that they remove from under the ground, they are exported to another country. No archaeologist have ever had the chance to study them. So there's not only a loss of the object itself, but there is a loss of all the knowledge that surround the object. And this is why UNESCO, as the international organization in charge of protecting cultural heritage, but also scientific knowledge, is so keen at supporting countries in addressing this problem. So the loss of information surrounding an object from under the ground or under the water is often perceived as important of the loss of the object. The last offense on this slide is the illicit import of export. In fact, most legislation protects cultural objects against illegal export. They are forbidden to be exported. And whenever an object is exported illegally, there is, of course, an offense to the object and a breach of the legislation. These offenses are often sanctioned against by national legislation. When speaking about intentional destruction of cultural heritage, I'm sure you are unfortunately familiar with these slides showing what has happened during the last 20 years in Afghanistan and in the Middle East. That was in the context of either an armed conflict or civil violence that has led to this kind of situation. But illegal excavation, has seen on that slide, that happens every day. That happens every day all over the world, and including in the Asia-Pacific region. So when we are speaking about illicit traffic in cultural objects, from a legal point of view, now I'm going to speak as a lawyer, there is always a breach of a law. Often, and that is the first square here, there is a breach of an export or an import law. Sometimes there is a breach of a criminal law. For instance, some legislation say that any removal of an object, cultural object, from either a museum or from under the ground is a crime against cultural heritage. Unless, of course, there is a proper permit. But there is a breach of law. There is, therefore, an illegal transfer of ownership. For instance, if an object is stolen from a museum in Kazakhstan, it's stolen, there is a breach of the Kazakh law. But if it goes abroad and someone buys it, there is a transfer of ownership, which is also illegal. So even the one who acquired it abroad has a title of property, of ownership, which is illegal too. We're going to give more information about that. Countries are deprived, therefore, of objects which they, under their national sovereignty, have declared that they were important. It has a political effect, and it has an effect on the future generation, because young people, people of future generation, are deprived of that object. They cannot study, they cannot admire it. And again, that is why UNESCO, as the international organization having the competence for protection of cultural heritage and knowledge, is looking at it. I cannot resist to share here what one of the former Director General of UNESCO said, Irina Bokova. I think she described quite well in English what at the intergovernmental level countries consider when they are dealing with illicit trafficking with cultural objects. Irina Bokova said, culture is much more than a tradable commodity. Cultural properties are significant not only because of their market value or scientific importance, they embody history and identity. The looting and illicit trafficking of cultural property erode the cement that holds communities and societies together. They cause irreversible damage that lastingly affects the ability of societies to develop, take shape, and recover from crisis. So in these few sentences, the former Director General of UNESCO actually moved the discussion even on a more, let us say, philosophical aspect, saying that the deprivation of cultural objects which are considered of importance also touch the identity of nations and communities. But let's go back to a more grassroots level now. If we look at the situation in the world, I have put on the slide this map of the world. We have basically countries that can fall in three categories, but some countries belong to 2 or 3 categories. We call source countries the countries which are the most affected by illicit traffic in cultural objects. Those we also call them country of origin, and many countries in Africa fall into that category. Many countries in South America, and a number of countries in Asia and the Pacific too. Then we have the transit countries. It is countries where cultural objects have been removed from source country, and then they are in transit for some time a few days, sometime a few months, sometime a few years, to be forgotten. And then after a while, they move to destination countries. And destination countries are countries where they are sold, where buyers do actually purchase these cultural objects. Sometimes in good faith, they don't know that they have been stolen. Sometimes not in good faith, they know very well that it's an object of illegal origin. And these are countries mainly North America, Europe, and a few countries in Asia, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and then a few countries which are both transit countries and destination countries. And that is particular, for instance, big metropolis in Asia and the Pacific, like metropolis in China, in in Thailand, Singapore, where there are actually wealthy people who are looking for this kind of object, either in good faith or not in good faith. So these countries are often both country of origin, source country, and countries of destination and transit countries. If we look at the situation of illicit traffic in cultural objects on a global perspective, we can observe that national law to protect against this kind of effects do exist almost everywhere. The problem is the enforcement of these laws. Even in the richest countries, and I take the example of Italy, for instance, which is in the top 15 in terms of wealth of countries and the World Bank statistics and so on, the enforcement is difficult. It doesn't mean that the countries do not do anything. And in the case of Italy, they actually do a lot. But the illegal trafficking has taken large dimensions. Moreover, in many countries, it is linked with impunity. It means that judiciary, prosecutors do not always realize that offense against cultural objects are serious. They can object, they can say, we have many other priorities, terrorism, violence, illicit traffic in drugs, for instance, which are much more important than illicit traffic in cultural objects. There is also perception among some art dealers and collectors that it's not that serious. There's nothing wrong with selling and buying protected cultural objects. Among some group, there is also a kind of pride to exhibit cultural objects in private house that are cultural objects, with knowing or not knowing, if they are in good faith, that these objects have an illegal origin. That's a fact that all over the world, the prosecution of offense against cultural objects are less implemented than for other kind of offense. However, during the last 10 years, perhaps 15 years, a number of cases have been brought to justice. There is also a number of studies made by criminologists and Interpol, the international organization of criminal police, have made research and have shown linkages with other kind of illicit traffic. So they have been able to give evidence that illicit traffic in cultural objects can go together with illicit traffic of weapons, cars, drugs, money laundering. But that's a recent trend. The sale in auction is also something quite interesting to observe. There's nothing wrong to sell in auction. Auction house do reputable work, no problem with that. But they can be used by traffickers to actually launder cultural objects of illicit provenance. They can give fake certificates, they can give all sorts of evidence so that they are put on auction, and then they are bought by, cultural objects are bought by collectors in good faith. And from the time they buy these objects in auction house, they believe that they have an authentic title of ownership. They can realize sometimes that they fell into a trap. Recently, when I say recently, let's say the last 15 years, internet sale is also playing a multiplying effect in the illicit traffic in cultural objects, in particular for those which have been stolen from clandestine excavation. These objects have not been described because they come from under the ground or under the water, and they are then put on sale on internet and easily bought by anybody, especially if they are small objects. Free ports, that's another concerning issue. As I'm not going to describe what is written here in the screen, but you can refer to it later. But basically, free ports are harbors. There are many all over the world where objects do not fall under the legislation of the country where the harbor is located during some time, pending they transfer to another country. And free ports are also used by money launderers to actually store works of art in order for this object to be forgotten. This introduction, this long introduction, was kind of describe what we mean by cultural object and illicit traffic. Now, the response to that traffic, and that is where not only national legislation, which I've been talking about, but international conventions come in the game. There are several conventions which can be applicable. The first is the Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the Event of Armed Conflict of 1954, called the Hague Convention, and its two protocols. It has been ratified by 133 state parties, including all countries in Central Asia and South Caucasus. But this convention only prohibits pillage and export under occupation deriving from an armed conflict. Outside of the situation of armed conflict, we have the second one on the screen, which is the UNESCO Convention on the means of prohibiting and preventing the illicit import, export, and transfer of ownership of cultural property of 1970. 141 states parties are part of it, including most countries in Central Asia and South Caucasus, except Turkmenistan. It is the most comprehensive convention about illicit traffic. But there are two others. The third one is Unidroit Convention on Stolen or Illegally Exported Cultural Objects of 1995. 50 states parties, including Azerbaijan and Georgia, none in Central Asia. It complements the UNESCO 1970 Convention. It was adopted 25 years after. Last but not least, the UNESCO Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage of 2001, 63 state parties, none in Central Asia and South Caucasus, is specific to underwater cultural heritage, including objects, not only those under the sea, but also those under lakes and rivers. So if we look at the map of the world, you will see in green that it's quite a universal instrument. Most countries in the world have ratified it, except some in Africa, a few, very few in Latin America, and one in Europe. And then you will see in Asia and the Pacific that apart from Turkmenistan and Thailand, most countries which have not joined the convention are those situated in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. The 1970 convention, the main one, was the first international convention on that topic. It is not self-executing. It means that in order to be effective, countries have to adopt national legislation. Most countries did. Either they had a legislation before they joined the convention, or they have adopted a legislation afterwards. but it is not retroactive. It means that its provision on restitution to the country of origin only apply after the entry into force of the convention in the states, the countries concerned. The convention contains three kinds of provision: preventive measures, restitution provisions, and provisions on international cooperation. Among preventive measures, so in the case of countries in Central Asia and South Caucasus, the state parties have to elaborate appropriate legislation, it's done everywhere, create national services for the protection of cultural heritage, establish national inventories of protected cultural property, and organize the supervision of archaeological excavations. Among the preventive measures are also an encouragement for national cooperation between culture, police, and customs services at national level. There is a request for antique dealers to keep registers of transactions. This is more difficult. I've observed that many countries have difficulties to oblige the antique dealers to actually keep these registers. Countries also have to encourage the adoption of ethical code and principles for the benefit of curators, collectors, and art dealers. Another provision which will be of interest for museum workers, the convention obliges states parties to prevent their museums and similar institutions from acquiring illegally exported cultural property originated from another state party. Museums in Central Asia are not authorized to acquire objects which have been exported illegally from another country. Of course, this brings the issue of the knowledge of the foreign law. And indeed, you may tell me, but as a museum curator, how do I know that this object that I intend to buy is actually forbidden to be exported from its country of origin? Fortunately, there is a database of export law available at UNESCO. I will tell you a little more later on. So actually, museum workers have the possibility of check, for instance, if that kind of object could be an African mask, it could be a terracotta statue originally from the Middle East. You can check and read the legislation in its translation to check whether these categories of object is forbidden to be exported. Moreover, countries which have joined the convention must prohibit the import of cultural property stolen from a museum or a religious or a secular public monuments or from similar institution in another state party, provided that such property is the inventory of that institution. And that is the case for you as museum workers. Imagine that an object is stolen from your museum and it arrives, let's say, in United Kingdom. The government of United Kingdom has the obligation to prohibit the import of that object stolen from your museum in your country if this object is in the inventory of that institution. Another preventive measure is to introduce a system of export certificates. As museum worker, you will tell me, but we do export cultural objects, either for a loan or for an exhibition abroad, sometimes for repair. And of course, in that case, the convention foresees that governments can issue export certificates. Export certificate should accompany all items of cultural properties exported in accordance to the law. States should prohibit the export of cultural property unless they are accompanied by the export certificate. Customs should check the export certificate both at the time of export and at the time of import in the country of destination. Countries of destination should prohibit the import of objects which are not accompanied by an export certificate. So this administrative export certificate is very important. Equally important are the sanctions. The importance, as I said, of prosecuting those in the countries of origin, the source country, or the transit country, or the countries of destination, who actually breach the law adopted under the convention. And imposition of sanction is equally important. There are also provisions on restitution. These are usually, there's an article called Article 7b(2), which actually is unfortunately a bit restrictive. It provides an obligation of restituting an object illegally exported, but in limited case. So let us imagine that an object is stolen from a museum in Kazakhstan and is found in a country of destination, let us say Germany. There is a possibility of having this object being restituted to the museum in Kazakhstan under conditions. The object should be in the inventory of the museum of origin. The convention should be enforced in the two countries concerned, Kazakhstan and Germany. The request for restitution must be done through diplomatic channel by the country of origin, in that case, the authorities of the government of Kazakhstan, which is going through diplomatic channel requesting to the authorities of Germany. There is a possibility of a just compensation to the innocent purchaser or to a person who has a valid title to that property. That is the case where the object would have been already bought by someone in Germany, and that person is in good faith, did not have an intention to breach the law. So the convention foresees the possibility of paying a just compensation. This was considered as a weakness of the convention by many countries because there's no definition of what a just compensation or an innocent purchaser is. That is why the Nidora Convention of 1995 has been adopted. I will tell you a few words later on. There are other provisions in the convention about international cooperation. In the 1970 convention says, and this is a very important one, any country which is facing a situation of pillage or archaeological or ethnological material can call upon other states parties. It's an obligation of solidarity. The states parties shall therefore participate in a concerted international effort to determine and carry out the necessary concrete measures. So this covers also cooperation not only between museums, but also between museums, police, and customs from all states parties to the convention. Very important provision. For instance, one of the main country of destination in the United States of America, and I give it the example of the US because it has a very elaborated mechanism under the convention to implement this obligation of international cooperation. The USA has concluded bilateral agreement under the convention with many countries listed on the screen, by which the USA commits itself to prevent the import of categories of objects which falls into typology. So the country of origin has to send photographs of the kind of object which are actually subjected to illicit traffic. It can be mask or wooden object from African country. It can be stone object from Cambodia. It can be terracotta from China. So on the basis of these photographs, the US authorities, including the customs, seize this kind of object. Number of successful results, this is only a few examples. Nepal have received object returned from the US under this system. In 2018, same for Germany, which returned objects to Afghanistan. In November 2020, UK restituted object to China. There is many of cases of successful international cooperation. Now, to join the convention, in fact, here I'm most speaking about Turkmenistan, which have not joined the convention, countries need to deposit an instrument to UNESCO, indicated, it's a letter, official letter, indicated that they accept the obligation of the convention. It then entered into force 3 months afterwards, and as soon as this happens, UNESCO Secretariat will assist the country who joined the convention through all kinds of technical assistance, capacity building, through workshops. The convention, 1970 convention, has governing bodies. It means that every 2 years, the 141 states parties meet, often it's in Paris, and they giving strategic orientation for the implementation of the convention. They also take measure to promote the convention. They also elect every 2 years 18 states which will be part of the so-called subsidiary committee. Subsidiary committee meet every year. Currently, there's 18 states, none from Central Asia and South Caucasus. So a recommendation, of course, would be that at the next election, one of the countries, of these countries, do apply to become member of the subsidiary committee. So that will be a good opportunity to familiar with the convention. The work is to share good practices, review the reports that 141 states have to send about the implementation of the convention every 2 years, but they also can give advice and guidance to UNESCO Secretariat on how to better promote the convention. I'll now tell a few words about the Nidora 1995 Convention on stolen or illegally exported cultural objects. This convention is not adopted under UNESCO. It is adopted under another international organization based in Rome, Italy, which is the International Institute for the Unification of Private Law. There are 50 states parties. They do not have to necessarily be member of UNIDROIT. The instrument of ratification are deposited to the government of Italy. The government of Azerbaijan and Georgia in South Caucasus have joined that convention, but no countries in Central Asia yet. The convention complements and clarifies the weak points of the 1970 convention and is of direct implementation. It means no need for an implementation law. It's directly applicable. So it can be invoked in courts and tribunals. The main advantage of that convention are the fact that it defines what is an innocent purchaser. An innocent purchaser, someone who claims to have bought a stolen object in good faith, must prove that he or she has tried whatever is possible to check that the object that he or she wants to buy is a legal one. And that means, for instance, checking with the police. So that's quite important. So it reduced the number of cases when an innocent purchaser can claim to have a compensation. The UNIDROIT Convention also says something very important. It says objects from illegal excavations are considered as stolen, which is very important because most legislation do include the theft of cultural objects under criminal law with severe sanctions. So the UNIDROIT Convention says objects from illegal excavation are considered as stolen. There are also more possibilities of restitution for objects which are not necessarily being stolen, but which have been exported illegally. So it's very beneficial to join the convention. And of course, I highly recommend to consider and ratify it like Azerbaijan and Georgia have done. Another institution which recently have been involved in the illicit traffic, fighting illicit traffic in cultural property is the UN Security Council. I'm not going to develop more, but since 2014, the UN Security Council have requested all UN member states to search, arrest, and prosecute individuals or groups involved in the trade of cultural objects from Syria and Iraq, on the basis that such trade contributes to the financing of terrorism. From 2014, the UN Security Council and the General Assembly of the UN have adopted several other important decisions and resolutions on illicit trafficking of cultural objects. So, as a conclusion of this part of my presentation, I would say illicit traffic in cultural objects is global. Response have been brought at global level through conventions and with UNESCO, UNIDROIT, World Customs Organization, Interpol, but also other organizations like UNODC, the UN Office for Drug and Crime, and the International Council of Museums. The ratification rate of the 1970 convention is quite satisfactory, but its implementation remains uneven globally. So if there is a political will to join the convention, with a few exceptions, I have observed that implementing the convention, even at national level, often suffer from a lack of will, a lack of political will. It's not always considered as a priority. Sometimes it's linked to financial means. Sometimes it's linked to an estimation that other trafficking are more serious. The ratification of the UNIDROIT Convention brings only benefits from countries in Central Asia. So clearly, it's, I think, a necessity to consider that one too. I have also observed that countries are can be very keen after they have been facing with an important theft of cultural heritage. Then everyone in country is moved, and there's a lot of declaration that they're going to do more, especially when an important object is found abroad. It can be a museum item, it can be an object dismantled from a monument, and then they claim the restitution when it's too late. And it's often very difficult. Also, a number of countries, in the case of China, Cambodia, are quite successful in obtaining the restitution. But it's a lot of effort and cost because it's too late. Countries are facing many difficulties to adopt preventive measures. Another difficulty is in the cooperation between police, culture, and customs. Most of the audience today is museum workers, and it's a fact that the professional networks do not necessarily include police and customs. I know it is the case in a number of countries, but not everywhere. So networking with police networks is also, with police and customs, is also very important for museum workers. Dealers and traders. Everywhere in the world, I also observe that governments have difficulties to regulate the trade in cultural objects. Again, especially in countries where trade and commerce is considered as a priority in the economic development, do resist to checking what the private sector is doing, in particular in antique and art dealer. So if, in a few words, if I say what is now urgent, well, certainly to join the convention, adopting the preventive measures, considering request in return and restitution of cultural property, cooperating with state parties, non-state parties, and cooperate with UNESCO and partner organization. And it will be the object of my next very short presentation, using the practical tool available. That concludes the main presentation that I want to share with you. I have a second one, which is a shorter one. It's precisely how to use the tools available, in particular for museum workers. So I now share another of my screens. Please give me a few minutes.
Yeah, let me add why Mr. Clement is switching between the presentations. If you have any questions or comments, so you can write them in the chat box. And once all presentations are over, we can answer those questions if we have any.
Okay. Implementing the conventions. Yes, this is where I speak about the tools. I will be a little bit fast on the first slides because these are topics that we have already covered. But what I can say is that most countries, if not all, have actually adopted a law prohibiting the export of what they considered as important cultural objects. The legislation is usually quite well adapted. I have observed that those lawyers and cultural officials who drafted the convention generally draft good legislation, especially the description of what is meant by important cultural objects. Again, the weakness is more how they implement this convention. There is also something which I have observed is that several countries have very strict laws. They are so strict and difficult to implement that it's actually impossible to implement. For instance, they forbid all trade of cultural objects. This is, to my view, creating a difficulty because it opens an underground trade. So I would certainly recommend that in the legislation, there is a space for a legal trade of carefully defined cultural objects. For instance, depending if they are not that ancient or under several conditions. Another thing is that guarding of archaeological sites. It's impossible to post a guard with a gun around all archaeological sites. So indeed, there are perhaps better kind of national measures like educating the local community so that they can contribute to the guarding of the archaeological site, instead of what unfortunately happens, being themselves involved in the trafficking. And there are good practices, for instance, by rewarding these local communities if they are involved in guarding the archaeological sites. It's very important also to establish specialized police services. Indeed, in several destination countries, and that is the case of France, which is an important destination country, but also UK, Italy, you have a special police trained to look at the offense against cultural objects. So if a country of origin, like countries in Central Asia or South Caucasus, creates such a police unit, which people who have been trained in recognizing cultural objects, they can easily link with their counterpart in the countries of destination. It is very important, therefore, to strengthen the cooperation with other countries also on the protection of cultural objects. Another categories of countries for which it's important to collaborate are the transit countries like Switzerland, Singapore, Hong Kong, Dubai. These are countries where the objects are transiting. Good police cooperation or museum cooperation is important. And last but not least, cooperation with international organizations. International organizations have developed many tools that I'm going to present in that last part of my presentation. The first one is the database on national cultural heritage law. This database is maintained by UNESCO. So if you, as a museum worker, want to know what is forbidden to be exported, for instance, from Thailand, Cambodia, Japan, you can look and see what categories are protected by this national law. You can even have the name of the person to contact. That database is run by UNESCO and is available on the UNESCO website. Another important tool is the UNESCO World Customs Organization model for an export certificate for cultural objects. You remember that I spoke to you about export certificate. Some countries do not have that, but a model is available, again, if you look at the website of UNESCO or of the World Customs Organization, WCO. So you can use that model. I mention it for museum workers because often it is the museum workers who have to fill in export certificates. Third practical tool, a model provision on state ownership of undiscovered cultural objects. Very important because under some legislation, well, the Nidora Convention recommend that states parties do consider that any object undiscovered, which lies under the ground or under the water, is of state property, belong to the state, which is a very important tool so that if that kind of object is found in a country of destination, well, one can, as a country of origin, claim that it has been stolen because it's belonged to the state. So that's an important model provision which can help countries to draft that kind of legal provision. The object ID, I'm sure many museum workers are familiar with this object ID. It is a checklist which is standardized. It means that the aim of the object ID is that so that all museum staff, but also police officers, customs officers, would describe a cultural object using the same kind of topics and in the same order. The type of object, the materials and the technique used, the measurements, the encryptions or marking that is on the object, etc., and so on. So it's a standard list to facilitate the description of an object, which can be used by museum workers, police, and customs all over the world. There is also another document produced by UNESCO and Interpol and the International Council of Museums, which is a checklist on basic action concerning cultural objects being offered for sale on the internet. You can download that list on UNESCO or Interpol or Ecom website. That helps the national authorities to actually look and control if internet is actually putting on sale their national treasures. Interpol has also developed very important tool. They have a long-established Interpol stolen overweight database, but more importantly, they developed in February 2021 the IDR. So I really invite you, it's accessible to anybody. I invite you to download this application on your smartphone, and you will be able to enter the IDR mobile X application developed by Interpol, under which you will be able to see 100,000 of objects which are currently being presented by Interpol as stolen. Interpol has similar database with criminals, but that exists for cultural objects too. And it's accessible to anybody. You can try after this webinar. It increases the chance for this object to be recovered, of course, because a collector would probably never want to buy an object which is in that Interpol database. So I recommend also museums to actually include stolen objects in that database. The UNESCO International Code of Ethics for Dealers is an attempt also for dealers to actually adopt some ethical rules in the work of buying or selling cultural objects. I will not go into detail into the Ecom Code of Ethics from Museums, because I'm aware that you had also a webinar by the representative of Ecom a few weeks ago. But I will sum up by saying that in 1986, the International Council of Museums developed a code of ethics for museums, which sets minimum professional standards, and encourages the recognition of values shared by the international museum community. And it addressed the issue of acquisitions, compliance with legislation, and return and restitution of objects. So they actually provides the provision that members of the museum profession should not support the illicit traffic or market in natural or cultural property directly or indirectly. I just show on the screen the article 2.3 on the provenance and due diligence, 4.5, the display of unprovenanced material, 5.1, identification of illegally or illicitly acquired objects, 6.2 on the return of cultural property, 6.3 on the restitution of cultural property. Last but not least, but I'm sure Sophie Delepierre from Ecom have mentioned to you this famous red list of cultural objects at risk. I highly recommend museum workers to actually use that possibility. It's not a list of actual stolen objects, but categories of objects that can be subjected to theft and traffic. So this targets in particular objects from under the ground or under the water. But in order, of course, to put photographs of that kind of object, which are by definition unknown and there's no photography of them, when museum workers may be asked to give photographs of similar objects which are currently suffering from illicit traffic. Again, I highly recommend. To conclude this second part and last part, and before the questions, I would, of course, saying again, as I said in the first part of my presentation, working together is a key to address illicit trafficking in cultural objects. And that, of course, involves very much the museum workers, but also the police, the customs, sometimes the dealers, if they can be reached, very difficult. Through all this, working together should involve the exchange of information before a problem occurs, collaboration when needed, coordination more systematic, and partnership more formal, establishing memorandum of understanding between these various professions. That ends my two presentations. I'm, of course, open to questions for the rest of my time. Thank you very much.
Большое спасибо, господин Клеман.
Thank you very much, Monsieur Clement. I think we can turn to questions right away. We have several questions. Before I will read them out loud, we will have some people watching today's session in YouTube. I want to remind you that we have video recordings of previous workshops, especially the one by Mademoiselle Delepierre. If you saw in the chat box, you can find some answers to the question how to put the cultural objects into database. Everything considering Ecom is has been already cleared. The question is, have you heard about the cultural objects from Central Asia or South Caucasus that were sold or somewhere in the world in recent years? And another question that is related to that. And the second question, how can we bring in the cultural objects into databases. So how can we register them in international databases? Whom should we contact? So what is the coordinating procedure? So should the museum make a request or talk to Ministry of Culture, or maybe with international police, or maybe we have to involve UNESCO office? So maybe like these three questions that I have announced, if I.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this question. The first question, have I been myself much informed about illicit traffic from Central Asia and South Caucasus? I must say that I haven't had the privilege to work much in that part of the world, but I have indeed heard in particular from South Caucasus in a number of years ago. I remember that there had been a few cases of requests by these countries through Interpol to retrieve cultural objects which have been illegally exported, and less from Central Asia from my own experience. That doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. Of course, the size of countries is an element which makes it extremely difficult to guard and control archaeological sites. So actually, the larger a country is, the more difficult it actually is to control this kind of trafficking. Registering, yes, indeed. Let me take a little bit of time to do that. The main source of registering is the Interpol database. Interpol database, one can introduce objects at the request of police services. So, concretely, if a museum worker in Central Asia wants to report theft of cultural objects in the Interpol database, these museum workers have to contact the national police. The national police will then contact Interpol. Interpol is the International Organization of Criminal Police. The members are the Ministry of Interior, the ministry in charge of police. That's why the coordination and the partnership between museums and police is important. And it's important that it's done before the problem happens. An agreement could be done, for instance, with National Museum under the Ministry of Culture, with the police under the Ministry of Interior, saying that museum workers can actually transmit to the police photographs of objects which have been stolen. Then the police will contact Interpol. That is for that kind of database. For the red list, which is not really a database, it is something which is done more at the level of the Ministry of Culture. It means that if a Ministry of Culture considers that a country is facing a problem of pillaging of, let's say, bronze object from under the ground, or can be old coins, gold coins, or terracotta statues, then the Ministry of Culture can actually ask Ecom to prepare a red list showing photographs of objects which are subject to illicit trafficking. So that's the second way. Now, there are also another kind of database. I didn't mention it in my presentation because it's used by dealers. It's called Art Loss Register. It's a private database. It's used by dealers and collectors, but it can be used by museum also. But let us say that a private museum often they use the art loss register. Private museums like to use the private database. But if they are subject of a theft, they do send photographs to this privately owned database on stolen object, which is based in United Kingdom, Art Loss Register. But the main one is the Interpol. UNESCO. UNESCO can help, but UNESCO does not have a database on stolen object. UNESCO has a database of national laws. So UNESCO office can help, but having been myself heading the UNESCO office in the past, what we do is that we recommend Ministry of Culture or museum workers, we respond exactly what I've told you. Contact your police. And UNESCO office can monitor that. UNESCO office can also accompany the museum worker or the Ministry of Culture when they meet the police. This is something that UNESCO can do, a facilitating work.
Thank you very much. And now the question is from Marcel Letanova. This is a very question considering the legislation. Do we use an international legislation expert of cultural objects? What do we understand? In our national legislation of the Republic of Kazakhstan, in law on culture, we have prohibition on import of the cultural objects. But then in another document of the Eurasian Union, Economic Union, we foresee the import or export of cultural objects. What can you say? Is it like a legal way to still import or export cultural objects? Nonetheless, we have the law.
Thank you. If I understand well, you see a kind of contradiction between two laws. Do I understand it right? Okay, if you have one law saying one thing, and if you have another law saying a different thing, there's a problem of coordination of law. And indeed, I have observed that in many countries, especially a kind of contradiction between a law protecting cultural objects and a law supporting the trade. This is often because the people who draft the law did not speak to each other. And then when it goes to Parliament for adoption, the parliamentaries did not necessarily make the links, or the legal service did not necessarily make the links. So it is indeed important, and this is mainly Ministry of Justice, or the ministry in charge of checking all the legislation. It can be the attorney's office, it can be the Ministry of Office, but there's also Ministry of Justice. But there's in each country an office which is checking all legislation, whether they come from, and they need to address this issue and then decide. And as I recommended before, if the prohibition is 100%, there will be a lot of difficulty. Sometimes there's a need to kind of be a little bit flexible and allow some space for the trade, but for very specific objects, which are less threatened, for instance.
Thank you. As it was a difficult legal question, so if Asel would like to clarify it, maybe you can come to the chat box and you can maybe ask more details about this question. We don't have any more questions. If we have some other speakers, allow me please to ask my question. You were talking about different international practices, so that the illicit turnover of illicit trafficking of the cultural objects is a global problem, and the countries have other priorities, yes, law enforcement priorities other than cultural objects. Can you tell me, please, do you have a positive example, a case when from the legal point of view there was a big trafficking of some cultural object from some region or some country, but then the country was able to come with legal barriers that helped? Before you answer my question, yes, Aselia Litanova, she will clarify her question.
Do you want me to respond now?
Yes, please. While Ms. Litanova is being connected, you can answer this question and then she will clarify hers.
Okay, all right. Yes, I have, of course, can give you certainly a few examples, but one is in Asia Pacific. It's the case of Cambodia. Cambodia in the 1990s was facing a big problem of illicit trafficking of stone statues. And they used all the tools, they decided to use all the tools that I presented, whether under the convention or outside of the convention. But clearly it required at a certain stage that a strong political will to put this issue at a higher level of the political agenda. In the case of Cambodia, it is a relatively small country which had a lot of monuments. These monuments were under pillage. And because it was affecting so much the cultural heritage and the identity of the nation, they actually decided to use as much as possible the means at their disposal. But that involved exactly what I said, is that it moved to a higher level of priority. It becomes a kind of national issue among, let us say, the top 5 national issues for their international cooperation. And then now I remember also several country in Africa did the same. That was the case of Mali, for instance, which was very vocal and actually also put it at the its international relation, the issue of pillaging of its cultural objects. In Latin America, several countries are also extremely vocal. Last but not least, China has also, and South Korea has also put that issue at a higher level of their political agenda. I wouldn't say number 1, of course, but in a high level, and then put financial means and training. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Litanova. The floor is yours. Yes, hello, participants, and Ms. Etienne Clement. Hello, my question is basically apologies, your sound is off. Sorry, my mic is behaving. The question is about the export of cultural objects. The word export, is it legally used? It does include trade, or is it just export? And it is not inclusive of trade. So if in simple terms, export is selling something as continuous or constant selling, but we can export cultural objects on a continuous basis. We can't say this year we're going to sell 500 paintings, next year we're going to sell 1,000 paintings. So how is the word export related to cultural objects? In our country, we are monitoring all those laws and legislation on exporting and illegal exporting of cultural objects. So in parallel, we have such a government service which is called a temporary export of cultural objects. So what's your comment on that?
Thank you very much. Yes, my comment is, of course, it's up to each country to define, if you speak about painting, what kind of cultural objects you want to prevent to be exported. And when it goes to painting, indeed, many countries do allow free trade of paintings that are less than 50 years of age, for instance, contemporary painting. On the contrary, when these paintings are older than 50 or 75 or even 100, then they are assimilated to other kind of cultural objects for which the government consider that they need to stay within the country. They are part of the cultural heritage. But the law can define exceptions, as you rightly say. There can be export for specific objects, museum exhibition abroad, temporary export, restoration of the painting, it goes to a laboratory abroad, then it's returned. There could be long-term loans. Very often now, museums do have long-term loans. It's possible for a museum in a country A to obtain from a museum of a country B a painting or an object and exhibit it for years. And in reverse, this country B is doing the same for the country A, so that the population of both countries can actually know and appreciate the cultural heritage of the other country. All that has to be defined by the national authorities, and UNESCO does not have a specific recommendation. It's under the sovereignty of each country to decide how strongly they want to forbid or facilitate the export of their cultural objects.
Thank you so much. Yes. According to the temporary export, yes, everything has been settled and regulated. Everything looks great. The license, issuing the export license is a kind of difficult situation. So sometimes we might need to change or amend the legislation. But thank you so much for your comment. Now it's much more clear. Thank you. Yes, thank you so much for your question and for your answer as well. I believe our time is almost running up. Since we don't have any more questions, I think we can call it a day. So I would like to thank our esteemed speaker again for this very interesting report on his part. And we have talked about illegal trafficking. We looked at it from both aspects. Like in the previous webinar, we looked at it from the museum community. Now we look at it from the legal point of view. Now, as a reminder, the recording of this webinar will be available at our YouTube channel. And all registered users will be provided with the material after the recording is made. If Mr. Clement wants to say a couple of words in conclusion, you're welcome. If not, I thank everyone and goodbye.
Well, I want to thank you very much. Spasiba, and good luck to all the museum professionals in Central Asia and South Caucasus.